The first thing Emilie saw when she woke was Gabriel staring down at her. She was confused by the deep frown on his face and the anger set in his eyes. But moreover, she found it hard to breathe. "Take her to the tank," she could hear Gabriel say between her gasping for breath. Gabriel, what's going on?" she managed. Her whole body felt strange, like it wasn't her own. She could hear the rumbling of her bed being wheeled along the floor and how the lights on the ceiling made her have to squint. It reminded her of the time she was wheeled through the hospital after having Adrien, the thoughts of her son making her wonder where he was. The sound of water pulled her out of her reverie and she found herself in a dim, unfamiliar room. Her bed came to a halt and Gabriel reappeared by her side. "This will all be fixed soon," he said in his usual monotonous tone before lifting her from her bed. She did not even have time to be surprised by the sight of the scaly appendage where her leg should be before she was plunged into the water. Gabriel turned around and glared at the figures that just entered the room, the head scientist and a much larger man beside him with an unconscious Marinette slung over his shoulder. "Throw her in there," he ordered before stalking out of the access room. Emilie was startled when another body came plummeting down into the water after her. She stared in wonderment at the mermaid in front of her and couldn't believe her eyes. But she had no reason to be more surprised. She was sporting a tail of her own. She awkwardly swam closer. The girl looked young, maybe in her teens, early 20s at most. She was also clad in a hospital gown, like her. Her body was motionless as it sank and her eyes were closed. Emilie feared that perhaps she was dead. A cold chill flooded her body. She was confused, terrified, and even angry. What had Gabriel been up to when she was unconscious? She looked at her surroundings to see that she was in a tank. She could hear a scuffle coming from outside of the room, angry, muffled voices. "Your father has forbidden you from leaving your room. Please return immediately." "I don't give a crap what he says." The door slammed open and Emilie's eyes widened in surprise as the figure approached the tank. At the sight of her, Adrien's expression mirrored hers. "Mom," he uttered unbelievingly. "Adrien?" She hesitated and went towards him for a better look. He looked different than how she remembered. Older, bigger. He was wearing a simple light blue shirt and trousers. She scanned his body to see his feet were bare and his left arm had gauze and tape attached to it. It looked as if he had just stormed out of a hospital room. "So this is the price she was talking about. Then that means I'll also," Adrien murmured. "Adrien?" Emilie questioned again. "You're so big now." Adrien smiled sadly at his mother's words. It must have been frightening to wake up to find that years have passed you by. "What's going on? When was this tank put here? And this..." She looked down to her tail. "And that girl, she was just put in here right after me. I don't even know if she's alive." She turned around and motioned to Marinette. "Just put in?" He was reeling from what she said. They were found almost a full 24 hours ago. "It was all for you," Gabriel's voice interrupted them. The click of the door shutting followed after. Adrien turned and glared at his father. "I brought this creature here in hopes it would cure you, but the wench fooled me," the man spat. "You fooled yourself," Adrien ground out. "You kidnapped Marinette and took her here against her will and used her blood on Mom based on unfounded tales. No one here is to blame but you and your arrogance." Emilie was horrified by Adrien's words about what Gabriel had done. She assumed that Marinette was the other girl in the tank. She still wasn't sure if the girl was alive, and if not, wouldn't that make her husband a murderer? Adrien's eyes held such a deep loathing and ferocity. She had never once seen him hold so much vitriol. Years had clearly passed while she was unconscious, and she couldn't recognize the people her husband and son had become. Adrien felt like an idiot for feeling a shred of gratefulness that they were found by Gabriel. After no leads the first day, his father had gotten hounds to follow their scent, finding them in an alleyway in a secluded area a few hours before the second day had ended. He had lost consciousness on the way back to the mansion. A whole day passed before he came to, and he was in a bed with an IV drip connected to his arm. The pain in his side had mostly subsided. His immediate thought was to find Marinette, and was relieved to see that she was in the tank. But to find out that Gabriel had withheld her from the water for so long despite her visible suffering made his insides churn with fury. The only logical conclusion was that Gabriel had kept her out thinking that she'd give him answers if the pain became too unbearable. It was basically torture. "Adrien?" A quiet mumble could be heard, and they all turned to see Marinette stirring. She opened her eyes slowly and straightened herself to see an unfamiliar face as well as Adrien and Gabriel on the other side of the glass. She quickly concluded that the woman in the tank was Adrien's mother. Gabriel approached the tank and was about to begin interrogating her again, but Emilie placed herself between him and Marinette. "Enough of this. I don't know what's going on, but I don't care to hear any of it come from you." "For me, you say? You couldn't even do me the decency of telling me what was going on before you tossed me in here." "Get out, Gabriel. I will hear what these kids have to say first," Emilie said harshly. Gabriel opened his mouth to say something but decided to hold his tongue. He knew from the beginning that she was going to be angry. As much as he wanted to defend himself, he hated being on the other end of his wife's ire. It would be in his best interest to give them all time. So without a word, he turned around and left the room. Emilie sighed and looked back and forth between Adrien and Marinette, giving them a gentle smile. "Will you two tell me everything?" she asked. They both nodded. "Firstly, what happened to me and how long have I been asleep?" "You had a stroke. It's been almost 4 years," Adrien supplied. "I see. It must have been hard for you." She looked saddened. She knew that he and Gabriel didn't get along much, and Adrien always had a hard time making friends. He had probably been so lonely. "So, mermaids? Or did your father put us through some freak Frankenstein experiments?" She joked, hoping to lighten the mood. She was scared and distraught, yes, but the two looked like they'd been through hell and back, and it hurt her to see such expressions on the kids. "Your husband had learned about some myths surrounding mermaids, things such as our flesh granting immortality or our blood having healing properties. Then he found me." The bitterness in Marinette's eyes was evident. Emilie felt sick to her stomach. When had her husband become so inhumane? Because Marinette had looked visibly unwell in her captivity, I imagine father was worried about the potency of her blood, so he had me spend time with her. I was so stupid then. I should have tried to help her escape before all of this happened, but I was happy to have a friend. Marinette swam closer to him, resting beside Emilie, and consoled him. "It's not your fault, and you did try to help me," she smiled, but he avoided her gaze. "Yeah, and almost got the both of us killed in the process." Emilie felt faint from every new piece of information she heard. They had to go through so much because her husband wasn't capable of letting go. "If I had been more forthcoming," Marinette whispered with hesitation. It was meaningless to mull on the what-ifs. She knew from the beginning, Gabriel would have never believed her and would have only accused her of lying in hopes that he'd release her. "He wouldn't have believed you anyway," Adrien mumbled, repeating her unspoken sentiments. Only now did he understand that his father was much too arrogant and stubborn to listen to anyone else. No one was going to stop him from following through with his plans. "How long do I have until I also turn?" he asked. Marinette shook her head, not knowing the answer. Emilie was growing increasingly confused, and they realized they hadn't explained why Emilie was now a mermaid. "The myth about mermaids isn't true, but because of some special circumstances, my blood will heal others, but in exchange, the recipient will be cursed to a life as a merperson. That's why you're in the current state you're in." "I'm sorry." Marinette bit her lip, feeling ashamed that she had not only cursed the women before her, but also the woman's son. "Why did you need to be healed, Adrien?" Emilie's voice was stern. She needed to know what happened to her beloved child, that this girl in front of her had no other choice than to offer her blood, despite knowing what would happen. Adrien froze at her tone. He could tell that she was undeniably angry, and he feared telling her what happened. He didn't want her to blame Marinette. Seeing the anxiety play across his face, Emilie's gaze softened and she smiled at him reassuringly. "Don't worry, I won't be mad. Neither of you are at fault for any of this," she said. Despite her words, he still felt hesitant to let her know. "He was shot while helping me escape," Marinette answered for him. Adrien could see his mother's face morph into pure rage. He wasn't kidding when he told Marinette previously that Emilie had a temper. It was that sole reason that she was able to put Gabriel in his place despite his cold and demeaning attitude. "Who did it?" she asked, her voice steady and calm, contrary to her expression. one of the divers that father had hired. The day I tried to take Marinette out, he had the same idea. I don't imagine he had any noble plans of taking her home though, Adrien said in a disgruntled manner, his hatred of the man overriding his concerns about making his mother angry. Marinette nodded, recalling that the man said he was going to make a fortune off of her as he tried to pull her out of the tank. Okay, Emilie said as she brought a hand up to nurse her growing headache. Adrien looked worried by the action, remembering her frequently doing the same before she collapsed. She raised her other hand and waved off his concern. I'm sorry, I'm okay, it's just a lot to take in. She looked back and forth between the two youngsters and went deep into thought. Her anger at Gabriel and the diver aside, there was a more pressing matter at hand. Adrien was going to turn. When? They weren't sure. She supposed it wasn't the most terrible thing in the world. He'd still be alive, at least. Is there a way to reverse this? Emilie asked. Marinette looked startled for a second by the question. I'm not sure, she answered. Can you tell me more about this curse? About mermaids? Marinette looked reluctant, but she knew she had to tell Emilie everything. After all, Emilie was now a mermaid and had the right to know. And so she had told her everything that she had told Adrien. Emilie listened intently, with her brows furrowed the whole time, as if she was trying to dissect the story for clues. If it's a curse, then there should be a way to break it, right? It all started because the jewels were separated, she said. Adrien's eyes lit up at her words. Marinette understood what Emilie was getting at, but it wasn't a guarantee. I thought about it every now and then. What if I could return the jewel to its rightful place? Would the curse be lifted then? But it was all pointless musing. I would only have 3 days to get it back to the temple, and considering the effects of the curse on me, after just a day and a half. Marinette trailed off. She wasn't even able to stand. There was no way for her to make the trek to a temple that was located up on a mountain. So you know where this temple is? Emilie pressed. I do, but... Returning it on your own may have been impossible, but you have us now, Adrien said optimistically. Don't get too excited yet, Adrien, Emilie gave him a weak smile. She hated raining on his parade, but she didn't want to get his hopes up. All 3 of them could end up in the tank for all they knew. I can't hand the jewel to anyone else, so I'm the one who has to return it. The temple is located near the village where the curse first started. It was only frequented a few times a year by the village head and a few other villagers who made the trek up the mountains to give offerings and prayers to the gods. The trip often took several days, so I never considered returning the jewel as a possibility, Marinette explained. Adrien was crestfallen. It wasn't so much that he cared about becoming a merman. Most of all, he wanted Marinette to be free from her quasi-immortality. This has been bugging me for a bit now, Emilie began as she scrutinized Marinette. The girl was taken aback by the suspicious gaze. She was sure she had told the both of them everything. How do you know so much? Emilie continued. From the sound of it, mermaids have been around for several hundred years, if not more. There have been many holders before you, and there isn't any discernible link between any of you. I would understand if the origin of the curse was a story passed down among the generations, but you seem to know of the most obscure details, as if you actually lived within that original village, she finished. Marinette blinked, finding the problem lying within the fact that she did tell them everything, and it ended up being too much information. Information that she shouldn't have known. That's because this jewel passes on the memories of everyone who's held it. From the village head who wanted more for his people, to the child who was barely half my age who couldn't understand what was happening. Emilie bit her lip, not believing that even such a young child was subject to such a life. Adrien stepped closer to the tank and laid his hand against the glass. He looked at Marinette intently and his eyes were glassy, as if he was about to cry. Marinette, how long have you held on to the jewel? He asked. He wanted to know how long she'd been suffering, but at the same time he was scared to hear the answer. Because in the back of his mind, he knew that Marinette wouldn't have it in her heart to let the jewel pass on, potentially claiming another small child. I don't know. I stopped counting a long time ago, she replied and turned away from him. It was the first time she outright lied to him, and he knew it. We'll have to ask Gabriel for help, Emilie suggested. No, Marinette's response was immediate. I don't trust him. Look, I understand that, and I'm not too happy with him right now either. No, Marinette stated again, cutting the woman off. He couldn't even be bothered to worry over Adrien. The moment he found us and saw that Adrien was safe, instead of being grateful that his son was alive, he berated him for trying to free me. Adrien was shot, and not a single word of sympathy or comfort. If you think that he's trustworthy, I get it, Emilie shouted, eyes ablaze and jaw clenched tightly in anger. Be it as it may, Gabriel was still her husband. Logically, she understood that he was in the wrong, and she was currently pissed enough to divorce him 100 times over. But the irrational part of her didn't want to hear any more of her husband's crimes. Marinette's gaze was just as fearsome as Emilie's, and Adrien panicked at the contentious air between the two. You may have lived longer than I have, but you're still clearly a child. What other choice do you have in this matter? Are you satisfied with living like this forever? Are you satisfied with Adrien being dragged into this? Marinette hated that she was right. She clenched her fists and swam away, back to her usual hiding spot. Her own situation aside, she couldn't let Adrien suffer because of her. There was no doubt in her mind that Gabriel would force both Emilie and Adrien into the tank instead of letting them go to the ocean. They'd live the rest of their lives in a lonely captivity. Emilie was right. She didn't have any other choice. She closed her eyes and sulked, only to be interrupted minutes later. Hey, Emilie's voice called gently, and Marinette turned around to see her pushing the seaweed aside and peeking through. I had Adrien go back to his room to rest. She smiled and settled down next to Marinette upon the lush plants. He really adores you, Emilie smiled. It's not hard to cling to others when you're lonely, Marinette stated, speaking of Adrien. The statement made Emilie feel a twinge of guilt. After all, she agreed with Gabriel about homeschooling after Adrien had been bullied. And with her and Gabriel not being social with other parents, Adrien naturally fell into a lonely world. Listen, I know you don't trust Gabriel, but he's the only resource we have to try to return the jewel and hopefully undo this curse. He has the money and the means to make it possible. I mean, look at this tank he had built. I'll talk to him and I won't tell him anything I don't have to. So please give it some consideration. With that, Emilie left Marinette to her space, as much as she could anyway. In the worst case, if the three of them were going to be stuck in this tank, Gabriel sure as hell better turn the mansion into an aquarium.